In this video, we're going to learn about praying mantids, and if you are the first person to answer what the defining characteristic is that separates a juvenile from an adult mantid, you will be the pinned comment in today's video. But let's get into the beige Becky basic biology. If you know anything about praying mantids, you probably think the females eat their partners. Or maybe you've noticed how bold they are. Regardless, praying mantids have been around for a really long time. We're talking since the Jurassic period, with the earliest fossils being found and dated to about 140 million years ago. Like all insects, they have an abdomen, a thorax, and a head. With their elongated thorax and placement of their forelegs, it almost looks like they have an elongated neck. Kind of like E.T. And I kind of enjoyed gathering pictures like these where they look like they're cheering or they're under arrest. And of course, it looks like they're praying. In fact, praying mantids get their name because that is what it looks like they're doing. The most recognizable praying mantis, the European mantis, is called Mantis religiosa. Their modified forelegs make it look like they are praying, but don't let your guard down because of that. These things are equipped with spines used specifically for piercing their prey. In fact, the modified forelegs are so murderous that sometimes they are identified as raptorial legs on diagrams. These, combined with their eyesight and a few other anatomical marvels, make them incredibly efficient ambush predators that can catch some really surprising meals. Their closest relatives are cockroaches and termites, but because they diverged from a common ancestor around 300 million years ago, they aren't even all that closely related. Praying mantids are something of their own, unique in the sense that as scientists study them more and more, it's almost more appropriate to compare them to vertebrates instead of their insect counterparts. Praying mantids are in the class Insecta in the order Mantidae. Within that order, there are 33 families and then 2,400 species, and their diversity is impressive at best. The smallest praying mantis is Bulbe pygmea. This little guy is found in the tropical rainforest of Southeast Asia, and they reach lengths of only 1 to 2 centimeters. Then there is the heaviest, Pleistosbolota guineacis, also known as the megamantis, and these guys can weigh about 13 grams and get to be about 11 centimeters in length. They are found in African countries like Ghana, Guinea, and Liberia. And then there's a tie between the Chinese stick mantis and the giant African stick mantis as the longest mantid. There was a Chinese stick mantis that was found in southern China, and this mantis was measured at 18 centimeters in length. And to this day, the specimen holds the world's record for being the longest. But the giant African stick mantis consistently reaches lengths of 17 centimeters, and they are found in sub-Saharan Africa. Generally speaking, they inhabit the warmer climates across all continents, except Antarctica, because it's cold there, no matter where you go. But the vast majority of mantid species inhabit the subtropical regions of Asia and then the tropical and sub-Saharan regions of Africa. There are also several species that are native to Europe, and several of those species have been introduced to North America, but Leda nutria minor inhabits the grasslands and deserts of Western North America, and it is the only mantid species native to Canada. It is just one species within 2 genera that exclusively live on the ground, and they are perfectly camouflaged for the gravelly and sandy terrain associated with grasslands and deserts. They're small in stature, only measuring less than 2 inches, and they have very small wings, so they don't really fly all that much, if at all. And to be honest, I never really think of mantids as being very strong flyers, and it turns out that that is fairly accurate. They can't fly distances that are comparable to bees or flies, but rather they use their wings to assist them with reaching greater distances from jumping. So basically they jump and then they start flapping their wings, and then their wings carry them across greater distances, more so than if they were to just jump. Females tend to be too heavy as a result of their reproductive system, so they tend to not fly nearly as much or as well compared to males. Like this guy, he was releasing some praying mantises in a field, and he was able to tell which ones were the females because instead of jumping off his camera device or his hand and then being able to fly a little bit, the females would just kind of flop right down because they were heavier. Now, outside of the females generally being heavier, that also means that they are bigger. They are generally larger, just in size compared to males, and they noticeably have a much rounder abdomen for their reproductive system. And so as a result of these differences, they are considered sexually dimorphic, meaning the males and the females look slightly different. Even though they aren't covering vast distances while in flight, scientists have noted that they are quick and accurate when they jump. And if you look at a couple of these video clips, it actually is quite impressive. They're over at point A, they disappear, and then all of a sudden they're teleporting to point B. Like, that's how quickly they jump. A study was done in 2015, and in this study they recorded a total of 381 jumps across 58 juvenile mantids, which, by the way, juvenile mantids do not have wings, so they cannot fly. So they were exclusively looking at the jumping. And the researchers found that mantids have these like specific steps that they follow for their takeoff, and then they have incredible control while in air. And all of that allows for them to accurately land on their target. Now, why is this so important? Well, it turns out that the smaller you are, the easier it is for you to kind of spin out of control when you're in the air. So think of a flea, right? Like, this is an insect that has no wings. They specifically and only jump. And when they jump, they are aiming for like the warm-bodied, delicious, blood-filled snack that is in front of them. And there really isn't like a localized target set in their mind. Presumably, we're not fleas, but it doesn't appear as though they have a localized target that they're aiming to land on. They just kind of jump towards that much larger warm body target, and while in air, they might position themselves or compensate in case they overshoot or undershoot their jump to ensure that they land somewhere on the body. They will take anything. But that doesn't seem to be the case for praying mantids. They do compensate, but it's to ensure that they land on a specific localized area within the target that they are jumping to. So if they were to see a warm-bodied, blood-filled snack directly in front of them, they would be thinking of a specific location that they would want to land when they jump, instead of just saying, I'm just going to fling myself over in this direction and hopefully I just land somewhere. So in that 2015 study, the scientists put praying mantids in an enclosure with a thin black rod that served as their target. This target was only a few centimeters away, so it was not very far, but it was definitely within the jumping distance for a praying mantis. And again, like if you watch them jump, they were able to reach the target faster than you think, or really faster than you can blink, about 80 milliseconds. Scientists initially thought the praying mantids would spin out of control and then make movements mid-air to compensate, so they would stay somewhat on target, much like any other insect. But it turns out that they were doing this lunge on the platform where they rotated their legs and abdomen both in different directions, and then after they took off, their legs and abdomen would shift clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever was needed to control their spin. And then those shifts aligned themselves in the air so that they landed on their target. The scientists saw the mantids were making adjustments depending on how far or close their targets were. For example, when they moved the targets a little closer to the mantids then modified their approach accordingly, meaning they spun themselves a little bit quicker mid-air so that they were able to kind of make that adjustment and ensure that they were parallel with their target when they landed. To see how much of the mantid's body was engaged for this very controlled jump and landing, the scientists then glued the mantis's abdomen. And yes, I do feel bad for the mantids that had their abdomens glued. Basically, what they were getting at with this study is they figured that within their abdomen, this like angular momentum was going to go from their abdomen and spread out to their legs and the rest of their body to help them control themselves midair. And so with the abdomens being glued, it restricted the mantids' ability to do that lunge properly. And so with the abdomen restricted, they expected the mantids to spin out of control and basically be unable to land on their target. But that's not really what they saw. Instead, they saw that the mantids were able to reach their target just fine, but without spreading that angular momentum, which starts at the abdomen, their landing was just kind of clumsy. And again, this research was done with juveniles who don't have any wings, but this research shows that when adults are flying or using their wings or just jumping or whatever, they're probably using that same kind of process to land on their target, i.e. their prey when they're ambushing it. Now, for this specific research, the researchers believe the juvenile praying mantids could be used as a model to set up robots. Basically, they kind of explained that flying robots are very expensive and they drain batteries pretty quickly. Apparently, drones' batteries only last 10 to 20 minutes. And they also talk about how walking robots are too slow. So perhaps by using the mantids as a model, we could develop some kind of jumping robot that will get your package delivered to you faster in a more energy efficient manner. Consume, consume, consume! And make babies. Praying mantids have a lifespan of between 4 weeks to 6 months, so not very long. And the smaller mantids have lifespans that are on the shorter side of things. Their general life cycle includes nymph, adolescent, and then adults. And there are these things called instars, and these are developmental phases that happen in between molts. And of course, molts are when an invertebrate kind of comes out of their old shell. After each molt, the nymph is gradually changing their appearance and overall growth with each instar, where basically with each molt, they're transitioning into an adolescent, and then they molt one more time as an adult, never to molt again. Overall, mantids will molt anywhere between 6 to 9 times in their lifetime. And from what I understand, and I didn't tell you this yet, but praying mantises are a very common pet to own for an insect. And so from what I understand, it is a sad day for the praying mantis pet owner when their pet mantis reaches its 6th molt, because they know it's probably going to be the last one and they're going to be grieving. And you know, I have had so many pets in my life. A lot of them are like cats and dogs, but I have owned fish since I was 15. A lot of people don't get it, but I totally grieve when one of these guys dies. So I definitely feel for the pet owners who own the praying mantises and how you only have them for less than a year in most cases before you have to grieve their loss. So I'm sorry for you guys. That's hard. Now, before we get into other characteristics about each life stage, let's talk about how those babies are made. Praying mantids reach sexual maturity after about 16 days. During the breeding season, the smaller sized male will kind of sneak up on the female and come at her from behind. Now, that is because females have been known to eat males after procreating, something that is called sexual cannibalism, but this isn't as common as you think. Female mantids display sexual cannibalism only about 13 to 28% of the time, but when they do, it makes a huge portion of their diet. Scientists have found that males make up about 63% of the female's diet during the breeding season. Sexual cannibalism is common across the animal kingdom, and there's been several hypotheses that kind of point to why it occurs. The first one being that females need the energy for egg production. Another hypothesis is that most of the females that display sexual cannibalism happen to be part of a species that's already naturally aggressive, so they just take that into the bedroom. Or maybe it's because the female was just getting rid of the male because she didn't want to mate with him to begin with. So she is being approached by a male who's considered like low quality or whatever, and then she's going to eat him, so she has the energy now to look for a high value male. Do all of those hypotheses kind of apply to praying mantids? No, that does not seem to be the case. Interestingly enough, though, a study that was done in 2016 discovered that while female praying mantids don't always default to eating their mate, there are some advantages to it from an evolutionary standpoint. This research studied Tendor sinensis, or the Chinese mantis, and the study found that females that devoured their males produced more male-derived amino acids in their eggs and reproductive tissues compared to females that did not eat their mates. On top of that, females that ate their mates developed more eggs. So this does kind of jive with the hypothesis that females need that extra energy to aid in egg production. And in this study, the females laid twice as many eggs compared to the females that didn't eat their mate. So the males have a couple of options. Two options, really. They can either mate with multiple females during the breeding season, and those females might not produce as many eggs, or the males can mate with one female, get eaten, and then they help their mate produce like a larger amount of eggs. So I don't know, gentlemen, tell me which one you would prefer. Aside from that, praying mantids are known to reproduce asexually through a process called parthenogenesis. For some praying mantis species, parthenogenesis is considered facultative, meaning they can kind of switch between reproducing sexually or asexually. And within the animal kingdom, it's kind of hard to pinpoint why parthenogenesis happens, because it's always been believed that parthenogenesis occurs in response to the lack of male presence. But then there are examples across the animal kingdom where females do it, even if there are plenty of males present. So they do it for reasons. But one mantis species called the Brunner's mantis is the only one that is known to reproduce exclusively through parthenogenesis. So all of the individuals that make up that species population are females. And this species, by the way, is endemic to the southern United States. So if you live in Texas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, any of those states, keep your eyes peeled for this one. And when you spot it, you could be all like, that's a female, and let me tell you why I know that. And then you'll be the coolest kid in school. True story. So this is very high level information about parthenogenesis, but in sexual reproduction, when the sperm enters the egg, the developmental process begins because the egg starts to cleavage. And then of course, some of the male's genetic material is incorporated into the offspring, which promotes genetic diversity. And the thing that initiates the egg cleavage process is the fact that the egg got pierced or pricked. And in sexual reproduction, that is done through the sperm cell, but in asexual reproduction, like parthenogenesis, the female ends up doing it internally somehow. And so for the Brunner's mantis, that's kind of what goes on with their reproductive cycle, and then the offspring land up being clones of the mother. Now, aside from this, Brunner's mantis follows the same life cycle as all the other praying mantis species, so let's get into that. After copulation takes place, about 3 weeks later, the female starts to look for a good place to produce an egg sac, and this is called an ootheca. Praying mantids will lay their eggs pretty much anywhere. They're very versatile in, where they're going to lay their eggs. They might place them on the ground, on a man-made structure, or on vegetation. And the egg sac is made up of this frothy material, which primarily consists of proteins. And the eggs are deposited while the egg sac is being constructed. So the eggs are coated in the secretion. And then the praying mantids will lay anywhere between a couple dozen to maybe a few hundred eggs, depending on the species and if the female ate her mate. The egg sac, upon completion, will be pretty small, with even the largest species creating an egg sac that is maybe 2 inches in length. This egg sac will eventually harden to protect the eggs from predation and the environmental conditions. Then within a few weeks to a few months, nymphs start to emerge. Now, in nearly all of the mantis species, the nymphs emerge out of their own hole from this egg sac, except the Brunner's mantis. For the Brunner's mantis, the egg sac is constructed with this point, and then all of the nymphs come out of this single point. All of the nymphs look like tiny adult praying mantises, but their coloration or their camouflage may look a little different from the adult. After they emerge, they may hang out around the egg sac for a few hours if there's food that's available, but really they all kind of start to disperse and find their own little place to inhabit. And this is because praying mantids are opportunistic predators, and they will cannibalize their siblings if they're struggling to feed themselves. So it really does just kind of get to a point that living in close proximity to their siblings is actually pretty dangerous. Nymphs will molt several times, with each time between the molts lasting only a couple of weeks, and then the molt itself usually takes under an hour. Then it takes a few hours for the praying mantis to harden, and during this time they are very vulnerable to predation and injury. One thing that results in deformities, injuries, or even death while they're molting is the lack of humidity. Humidity kind of just allows for the praying mantis to emerge out of its molt with ease. And it's sort of out of their control in the wild, but I read that when people's pet mantises start to molt, they kind of crank up the humidity so that the mantis doesn't run into significant issues. In between molts, nymphs are eating like crazy because they're growing like crazy, and their hunting skills are innate, meaning that they are born with it. The adults aren't teaching them how to become these like really proficient ambush killers. Now, as I said, nymphs look like very small adults, with maybe a few exceptions with like their coloration and things like that. When they emerge from their molts, they're looking a little bit larger because they're growing, and then they might have coloration that is beginning to look more similar to the adults, and then their features land up looking more defined, like their spines on their forelegs are going to be bigger and sharper. The literature didn't really say anything about the defining characteristics to distinguish a nymph from an adolescent, but they are considered an adult when they develop wings. So nymphs and adolescents don't have wings, and then when the praying mantis emerges from their molt and they have wings all of a sudden, then they are considered an adult. And of course, as I said, they will never molt as an adult. Once they molt and they come out with wings, they never molt again. They will basically mate and die at that point. So I think it's probably safe to say that maybe like the 1 or 2 molts that take place before the wings show up, that's about when they're considered an adolescent, and then anything previously and anything before that is considered being a nymph. Crypsis and mimicry are very similar things, and the goals are pretty much the same. The animal is trying to blend in to avoid predators or to hide themselves so they are better at catching their prey. Crypsis is when an animal has a color palette that generally matches their environment, and then the patterns do this thing called edge disruption, where the combination of the color pattern and edge disruption makes it so that the animal blends in with their environment, and then the shape of that animal is broken up with basically like shading. So Leda nutria minor, right? The only praying mantis that is native to Canada has this color palette that blends in really well with the gravelly substrate associated with deserts and grasslands. And because their pattern is mottled, they blend in with like the shading and the shadows associated with the substrate, so that the praying mantis shape is broken up and they become less visible to predators. So that is what I mean by crypsis and specifically edge disruption. But crypsis has some drawbacks as well. If you were to pluck Leda nutria minor out of its environment and place it in front of a purple background, you'd probably notice it. To make it a little bit more practical, if you were to take Leda nutria minor out of the grassland desert environment in which it's native to and put it in a rainforest, it might struggle a little bit to hide itself from predators because it might actually stand out a little bit more with its coloration. But Some animals are adapted to Crypsis that is highly effective in heterogeneous environments. And by heterogeneous environments, I mean something like a rainforest where, especially when you're thinking about mantids, let's say mantids that are living on a tree, they might be coming across microhabitats that look very different and don't necessarily match their Crypsis, but they somehow are making it work so that they avoid predation. So there was this study that was done in 2021 where they investigated this effectiveness by collecting juvenile morphospecies with different color variations. And so these color variations were defined as white, green, and gray. And they tested how well their camouflage worked on different tree trunks. And for the study purposes, they were calling these backgrounds. But basically, a white tree trunk or a white background is a tree that is covered in lichen, so it's going to have like a lighter color in appearance. And then there were also tree trunks or backgrounds that are green-brown, and this was typically a tree trunk that was covered in bryophytes. So the lichen and the bryophytes were two different microhabitats that could be on the same tree just a few centimeters away from each other, right? So it's not uncommon to see a tree trunk in the rainforest that would have both of these microhabitats. And they wanted to see how well these morphospecies adapted via Crypsis with that heterogeneous type environment with those microhabitats. So they did this in two ways. The first one is they took photographs of these mantids and then they basically like manipulated the images in a variety of ways to create a paper model, right? So they were just trying to make the paper model look really accurate so that you couldn't tell that it was made out of paper. Then these models were fastened onto various tree trunks and humans were asked to spot them. And then the time and the distance for spotting them was recorded. The second thing they did is they ran a program where the edge disruption was measured that was modeled off of the blue tit. Now, the blue tit is this bird that commonly preys on insects, including praying mantids, and they're actually studied quite extensively on their ability to detect insects with respect to their camouflage and coloration. So this was looking to see how easily can a real predator see these mantids up against various backgrounds. So generally, it took the humans a much longer time to find the mantids that were matched with its background, meaning it was hard for humans to find like the white praying mantis on the lichen-covered tree trunk, or it was hard for them to find the green praying mantis on the green-brown bryophyte covered tree trunk, right? But between those two, it was much harder for the humans to spot the green on green compared to the white on white. And so that is to say that for the human predator, at least, the green praying mantis was better equipped with its Crypsis than the white mantis, particularly when it was on the green-brown tree trunk. Overall, the closer humans got to the model, the easier it was to find the praying mantis, even when the backgrounds were matching just fine. That all makes total sense to me. As a human being, those results don't really surprise me all that much. But for the blue tit model, the study found that the white and gray mantids blended in pretty well regardless of the tree trunk. So that basically is to say that for the program that they read, the blue tit model was having a harder time finding the white and gray mantids pretty much no matter what type of background they were up against. But once again, the green praying mantis was really hard to detect on the green-brown tree trunk. So when you look at those two ways that they studied the praying mantis's ability to hide in those different environments, basically like the green praying mantis did really, really well with its Crypsis as long as it was hiding in the bryophytes. And if it was anywhere else, its chances of being eaten, whether it be by a human, I know we're not really lining up to eat those things, or they would be found by the blue tit. And if you think about the application of this study, think about the size of praying mantids, the size of the tree trunks, which again, this study took place in the Amazon rainforest. So you're talking about trees that are like hundreds of feet tall, and then plenty like patches of these microhabitats that exist on the same tree trunk, all within a few inches of each other. And then on top of that, the praying mantids are predators So they're all competing essentially for the same resources. So this study showed that while the crypsis of the gray and white mantids was okay across the different microhabitats, the crypsis of the green mantids only hid them exceptionally well in the bryophyte microhabitat, and those differences were different enough that they should remain in balance within the different niches, even on the same tree. Now, mimicry is when the animal looks like something else, and that something else may be a stick, a part of a flower, or another animal that has a reputation for just kind of being yucky tasting. Similarly, if you took this animal and put it in an environment where maybe that flower that the organism is mimicking doesn't exist, it'll stand out more. Next thing you know, you're being taste tested by every predator in that environment. One of the more complex examples of mimicry in the mantid world is the orchid mantis, and that's because the baby mantids, or the nymphs, mimic the look of an assassin bug, and then the adults masquerade as orchids. After incubation in the egg case for about 6 to 8 weeks, nymphs hatch with this reddish body and then a head and appendages that are black. And these markings mimic the assassin bugs of the tropical rainforest of Southeast Asia. Assassin bugs are efficient predators and are known to deliver painful bites even to humans. So there aren't that many predators that are willing to attempt to prey on them. So the baby orchid mantis' strategy is, if they look like that guy, then predation on them may decrease in return. But they do not stay looking like assassin bugs for very long. Only after a few months, in about 6 to 8 weeks, the nymphs morph into an adult and thus emerge from their molt looking like the white and pink flowers that they mimic. Now, as far as we can tell, orchid mantids are primarily looking like an orchid to blend in with the flower, and then an unsuspecting pollinator comes by, and thus the mantis is able to take that opportunity to acquire an easy meal. But what if I were to tell you that scientists think that something else is going on? One researcher spoke on his observations from his research in 2014 on how prey interact with flowers versus the orchid mantis, and this is what he has to say. This is the only animal in the world that we know of that resembles a flower blossom to attract prey. There are other animals that are known to camouflage themselves amongst the flowers and ambush their prey items, but they do not actually attract pollinators themselves. The orchid mantis is unique in that the mantis itself is the attractive stimulus. This means that the mantis can sit away from flowers, perhaps on leaves or bark, and still lure in pollinators. So this means that while other predators may camouflage themselves to look like the vegetation that attracts pollinators, and then they take the opportunity to ambush their prey item in an unsuspecting way, the orchid mantis is doing that, but also something else. So this study from 2014, the scientists went to this naturally forested area, and they counted how many times pollinators visited a vertically placed stick, an orchid mantis, and then a common Chinese orchid. And this is the orchid that the orchid mantis is mimicking. And then they tallied how many times a pollinator visited each of these attractants for a total of 30 hours. When they tallied it all up, the pollinators visited the mantis more than the stick in the flower, meaning that the orchid mantis must have been attracting the pollinators more than the flowers themselves. And so the researchers do think that something else is going on. And before I do go on, I will have to say what I kept thinking about when I was reading this study is that we don't really know too much about the orchid mantis biology. And so if you're really interested in insects and entomology, maybe your research focus on the orchid mantis would have some advantages, because there's a lot of knowledge gaps associated with the orchid mantis. But anyways, for this study, they basically think that the orchid mantis could potentially be releasing chemicals that are attractants to the pollinators, or they were doing some kind of movement to lure in the pollinators, but they do realize that they didn't observe or document such types of movements for the purposes of this study. But we do know that orchid mantises will kind of move in this way to make it look like they are a flower that's swaying in the wind. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the video and learning a few things. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so it may reach more people just like you who want to learn more about our fellow earthlings we share this planet with. Thanks so much, and let's get back to it. Now, a lot of the things that I've talked about in this video so far kind of showcase how and why praying mantids are exceptional and terrifying ambush predators. One of the last features that helps them be the killers that they are their eyes. At first you see their two round eyes with these black dots that kind of move, almost like they are tracking you. Those are compound eyes with hexagonal receptors called omnitidia. Larger species can have about 10,000 individual omnitidia in each eye. Now the black dots, though they look like pupils, they are not really pupils. They're called omnipupils. Basically, they're pseudo-pupils, but pretty much they're just omnitidia that are absorbing light. Think of someone holding a cluster of straws. You can't see into each straw equally, and you can see deeper into only some, depending on your angle. The darkness moves with your perception, and the darkness that you see is the absorbance of light. So the omnipupils of the praying mantis work in a similar way. So in reality, their pupils, they appear to be watching you, but it's a little bit of an optical illusion. However, their eyesight is somewhat of a marvel in the insect world, and it is actually more appropriate to compare their vision to vertebrates because they have stereopsis vision, which is depth perception. Something that all vertebrates have, but they are the only insect that have this type of vision, albeit their stereopsis is a little simpler. For us, both of our eyes work together to basically see a single image, even though each of our eyes are seeing that image from a slightly different position. I mean, think about it. If you're looking at a tree in front of you and you cover your right eye and then cover your left, that tree, depending on which eye you're covering, is going to kind of have a slight positional move, right? But when both of your eyes are uncovered, it all looks like a single object. And if you see it very clearly, so if you have 20/20 vision, the two images from your eyes will match up perfectly, and then you see this clear image. And then from that, you could kind of judge how far or close that image is. And then if the images from both of your eyes don't match up precisely, then you might see a slightly blurry image depending on how bad your eyesight is. And with our depth perception, we typically can judge depth based on luminance and shading or by sizes, right? So think about like a Bob Ross painting where he's painting one of his famous mountain scenes. The mountains in the foreground will be smaller compared to the mountains in the background, and they may be shaded a little differently. There was a study that was done in 1983 that tested the praying mantids' depth perception by placing a prey item in front of them and then measuring their strike distance. And it was in this study that they were able to identify that the praying mantis is pretty darn accurate at getting its target. And so they had the inclination that the praying mantis probably did have depth perception. So then they manipulated the mantid's eyesight by placing a prism in front of them, which made the prey item look like it was closer than it actually was. As a result of that manipulation, the mantid's strike distance matched the illusion perceived by the prism, meaning the striking distance was shorter than the actual distance of that prey item. So that was probably one of the first studies that gave scientists the inclination that praying mantids have stereopsis. Then in 2018, there was a study that expanded on that 1983 study to see if praying mantids had depth perception like most vertebrates. And in this study, they equipped the mantids with these 3D glasses. And I know you're wondering, how the heck did they fasten those glasses onto the praying mantids? And it turns out that they used a mixture of beeswax and rosin to put on the lenses. And you will also notice that the praying mantids glasses are green and blue, whereas the ones that we typically use, it's usually red and blue. The scientists opted to not do the color red for their lenses because a lot of insects just don't see the color red very well. All right, so they placed the mantids in front of a movie screen, and then they did a couple of tests. On screen were dots that were either uniformly 25 pixels or 60 pixels in size. Basically, this is just how are they going to strike at their target with small dots versus large dots. And then the target would swirl all around the screen until it kind of reached the center of the screen, and then there were about 2 seconds of these jerky up and down movements. Then they tested the mantis's striking response while manipulating their eyesight through positioning and lighting of the dots. So the way our normal 3D vision works is through a condition called correlated. That is, again, like I said, the two images will be seen with slightly different perspective from each eye, and then your eye works together to make it so that you see one clear image. In the praying mantis research, their correlated vision was done by having 2 white dots. So the right eye was meant to see a white dot, and then the left eye was meant to see a white dot. And of course, their eyes would work together to see one white dot. Then they tested something else that they called anti-correlated, which is something you would never see in nature. But basically, one eye would see a white dot and then the other one would see a black dot. And the scientists, they were testing humans alongside with the mantids throughout this research. When you manipulated humans' eyesight with this anti-correlated condition, it throws off their depth perception entirely. And they did this to the mantids to see whether their depth perception was thrown off like ours. Then they also manipulated the mantids' eyesight with a condition called uncorrelated. And so this is where the position and the luminance of the dots didn't match in any way, shape, or form between the two eyes. And so they used uncorrelated conditions to test how the praying mantis perceived motion and lighting detection. As the results came in for the praying mantids, the researchers found that while humans were all sorts of confused with their depth perception under anti-correlated and uncorrelated manipulation, the mantids were able to strike the target in front of them just fine. And of course, this was quite astounding because the results were showing that praying mantids have 3D vision, but they're kind of operating outside of what we humans can relate to. So the researchers kind of started to fall back on their observations, and they observed that the mantids only appeared to see the dots in these various manipulated forms while the dot was moving. So if it stood still, it was like they were the T-Rex in the original Jurassic Park.
10. Don't move.
Meaning the mantis couldn't detect the target if it wasn't moving. So it was concluded that mantid stereopsis doesn't work for static, unmoving images. However, they can perceive depth of objects that are perfectly camouflaged, even when that object is moving only slightly. And this is why I said that their 3D vision is simpler than ours. Their 3D vision is essentially using very little computational power and achieves still some pretty good results with depth perception. And again, this research was kind of expanding upon the praying mantis to use them as a model for robotics. Their 3D vision is essentially using very little computational power, and they still are achieving pretty good results. And much like the jumping experiment, the researchers for this experiment wants to kind of use the praying mantis as a model for robotics applications. For this study, the scientists said that they want to be able to use the praying mantis eyesight as a model for robotic sight and or motion detection. All right, so 2 eyes down, 3 more to go. On top of their head, they have 3 eyes. These are considered simple eyes called ocelli, and most flying insects have ocelli. These offer additional light detection, and they function very similarly to humans' eyes in the sense that they are comprised of a single lens to collect light, and then they project the light onto a bunch of cells known as photoreceptors. Ocelli do not provide image detail. You basically will see nothing but blurriness with these eyes, but they do serve as light management. The light management assists the insects with their orientation, and this is why flying insects have them. The ocelli allow for them to determine whether they're flying right side up or upside down, knowing that more light is going to be up on top and less light is going to be down below them. And in case you were wondering, one of the hypotheses that can answer the burning question of why do insects appear to be attracted to light is due to our light sources fucking up their orientation. So if you think about it, our light sources are kind of confusing to them because normally they orient themselves through the stars, the moon, and the sun, and all of our light sources are well below those three things. So porch lights, street lights, campfires, headlights, all of those light sources presumably make the insects feel like they are not flying right side up. And so as they're trying to correct their orientation, we basically see them kamikazing right into a flame. So anyways, that's it for the ocelli. Let's move on to their hearing. Insects' ability to hear is quite unique because if you haven't noticed, they don't have ears. It was once believed that insects, including praying mantids, were deaf. And then it was believed that praying mantids didn't need to hear because they're ambush predators. They just sit and wait for an opportunity to come by. But in 1986, scientists found that praying mantids have a specialized sense of acoustic hearing that is possible through what is called a cyclopean ear. This is a single ear or hearing organ located in their thorax between the metathoracic legs specifically. And this ear detects frequencies between 25 and 45 kilohertz with a threshold of 55 to 60 decibels. So these are frequencies that are not audible to humans. While you would probably guess this ear is primarily used to hear prey, that does not actually seem to be why it initially evolved. One study from 1986 noted that praying mantids would abruptly change their flight path while flying in the presence of bats. Given the frequency of echolocation and the frequencies the cyclopean ear can detect, this study concluded that the cyclopean ear is not used to hear prey, but instead it's used to dodge bat echolocation, as echolocation is how bats detect their prey, and bats commonly prey upon praying mantids. However, one study constructed a phylogenetic tree to understand when the cyclopean ear first appeared, and they believe it appeared roughly around 120 million years ago. If you remember, I said earlier that some of the oldest mantis fossils dated to about 140 million years ago. So not all mantids have a cyclopean ear, and that is true to this day. The lack of a true cyclopean ear is present in several extant species, one being Chaetiza, and this is one of the most primitive representatives of the mantis species. On the flip side, some mantids have auditory systems that evolved from the cyclopean ear, but over time they experience secondary loss through ecological pressures, and so their system can hear different frequencies and they use it for other things. And so that does now include being able to hear their prey, mating, and other forms of communication. One piece that I thought was interesting from the study is while praying mantids with a true cyclopean ear appear to use it to avoid predation from bats didn't come onto the scene until about 63 million years ago. Yeah. So bats didn't show up until about 57 million years after the cyclopean ear first appeared in mantids. So that means that there's some other predator or other trigger stimuli, and again, this could be mating or other forms of communication, where the cyclopean ear gave the mantids living back then some advantage to their survival. From their modified forelimbs to their unique eyesight, all of these characteristics are the reasons why they are truly a unique insect like none other. And while gathering this information, I came across some unique species of mantids that deserve some honorable mentions. The ghost mantis is a species of mantis that is commonly kept as a pet across the world, but they're native to Africa and Madagascar. Their mimicry disguises them as dead leaves, and they thrive in dry shrubland and grasslands. They are on the smaller side, reaching lengths of only about 2 inches, and while in captivity they can live to be about a year old, but on average in the wild they live to be about 8 months. Then there's the devil's flower mantis. This is a beautiful mantis species that is the only of its kind in the genus Idolomantis. It's native to eastern Africa and get to be about 11 centimeters long. When they are threatened, they spread their wings out to make them look bigger than they actually are, and they are considered one of the shyer praying mantis species. Then there's the spiny flower praying mantis. These guys are native to southern and eastern Africa. The nymphs of this species start out darker in color, and then they gradually transform to the colorful adults with owl-like eyes on their back. And the owl-like eyes are meant to startle or kind of psych out their predators. So, praying mantids. They are diverse, strange at times, but it works for them. They've been around for a long time, and to be honest, it was quite refreshing to learn that they are generally doing okay surviving in the Anthropocene. That's going to do it for today, guys. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more from me, and we will just see you in the next one. Bye!